Welcome to this explainer. I am so thrilled you're here today because we are going to decode something absolutely wild. Have you ever wondered how authoritarian regimes actually survive? We see them in the news constantly, right? Regimes that seem entirely disconnected from reality, making decisions that completely puzzle the rest of the world. From the outside looking in, the actions of dictators can sometimes look like absolute chaos or just pure megalomania. But what if I told you that underneath those terrifying headlines, there's actually a cold, hard, entirely predictable set of mechanics at play? Today, we're going to break down the underlying math of how regimes hold on to power, drawing on some truly incredible political science research.
I want you to keep one big central question in the back of your mind as we go through this explainer today. Why do some leaders invest their country's wealth into building public schools and hospitals, while others funnel those exact same resources into building secret police forces and paramilitary guards? It's really easy to just shrug and say, well, some leaders are good and some are bad. But what we are going to see is that dictatorial oppression isn't random madness at all. It's a highly calculated survival strategy.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. 1. The math of power. 2. The logic of oppression. 3. The rise of personalistic dictators. 4. Protest, migration, and rebellion. 5. How dictatorships break down. And finally, 6. The aftermath of intervention. Part 1. The math of power. Let's calculate survival. So to really grasp the math of power, we need to look at an objective equation that drives literally all governments, whether it's a thriving democracy or a brutal autocracy. It all really boils down to two key groups of people. The first is what political scientists call the selectorate, or S for short. The selectorate is the broad subset of a country's population that has at least a nominal on paper say in choosing the leader. In a democracy, well, this is all eligible voters. In a rigged autocracy, it might be the millions of members of the ruling party. Or in a traditional absolute monarchy, it could be the extended royal family and the aristocracy. Basically, this is the massive pool from which the leader draws their support. Then, you've got group number 2, the winning coalition, or W. This is the essential, much smaller subset of the selectorate whose direct, tangible support is absolutely required to keep that leader in power. In a democracy, this is the block of voters that actually wins you the election. In a military junta, it might literally just be a handful of key generals. And here is the secret. The ratio between these two groups, the winning coalition and the selectorate, mathematically determines whether a leader survives by providing public goods for everyone or private rewards for a select few. Think about how the welfare of that inner circle actually plays out. When a winning coalition is tiny, the leader can just pay them off with massive private rewards. But if you expand that coalition, bringing more people into the fold, those private rewards naturally get diluted, and the welfare of the coalition actually drops, until it hits a sort of valley, before eventually rising again as public goods like infrastructure and schools kick in. This math proves exactly why an authoritarian leader and their inner circle prefer to purge rivals. It shrinks the coalition, right? It concentrates the wealth and power among an even smaller, richer elite, rather than diluting their wealth by enfranchising more people. Moving on to part 2. The logic of oppression. Oppression as a survival strategy. Right, so we've got the math of coalition size down, but how are these rules actually enforced in the real world? We usually view oppression as just a symptom of cruelty, but the research shows it's actually a highly calculated punishment strategy. It's intended to deter challenges by drastically raising the costs of failure. Extreme state violence, whether we're talking about Stalin's Great Terror or Lee Kuan Yew's systemic legal suppression of opponents in Singapore, isn't an accident. It is a structural requirement. Because if you have a tiny winning coalition hoarding all the country's wealth, you absolutely must use terror and suppression to keep them loyal, and to keep the massive, disenfranchised population from rising up to take those resources back. This correlation becomes super obvious when we look at the actual human rights abuse data from Amnesty International and the US State Department. Notice the relationship here. Systems with a large winning coalition, democracies, score incredibly low on human rights abuses. But systems with a small winning coalition, autocracies, correlate with drastically higher abuse scores. Simply put, the smaller the group you need to keep happy, the more oppressively you treat everyone else. But here's the crazy part. Who exactly gets oppressed? There's a real dark irony here. We know the disenfranchised are oppressed to prevent revolution, and the wider selectorate is oppressed to deter them from defecting to a challenger. But the absolute highest intensity of state violence, that is usually reserved for the dictator's own inner circle, the rival challengers. Because they already have power and access, they are the most dangerous. Autocrats frequently murder their own top generals and party officials because that, historically, is where the true threat lies. Part 3, Rise of Personalist Dictators, the Blueprint of Consolidation. So how does all this abstract math map onto actual historical reality? Well, let's crack open the dictator's playbook. The research outlines a very clear step-by-step process of consolidation. Look at Saddam Hussein's Iraq, for example. First, you seize power. Second, you immediately purge the inner circle. Saddam literally handed pistols to his ministers and forced them to execute their colleagues just to ensure blood loyalty. Third, because the dictator inherently fears the regular military that originally brought them to power, knowing full well they could easily orchestrate another coup, they create civilian support parties and specialized paramilitary forces that answer only to them. And fourth, they intentionally hollow out that regular military, starving out of resources and competent leadership to prevent it from organizing. To consolidate absolute personal control, the autocrat literally has to destroy their own state institutions. Now, we absolutely have to distinguish this from other forms of autocracy. Compare a collegial military junta to a personalist dictatorship. In a junta, a group of officers shares power. If things get really bad, they can often negotiate a peaceful transition, step down, and safely return to the barracks. But a personalist dictator, they have spent years murdering rivals and hollowing out the state. They have no safe exit. They fear extreme post-exit punishment, which means they will absolutely refuse to negotiate and will fight to the bitter, violent end.
Part 4, Protest, Migration, and Rebellion, the breaking point.
So what happens to the everyday people actually living under this math? Well, when a regime completely blocks institutional change, hoards all the private goods for the elite, and violently suppresses dissent, citizens are logically forced into some extreme actions just to improve their welfare. The first choice is often an exit strategy, migration. And the data backs this up. People naturally flee small coalition states for large coalition democracies where public goods are actually shared. When exit isn't possible or the suffering just becomes too great, the disenfranchised resort to giving voice to their anger through demonstrations, strikes, and ultimately armed rebellion and civil war.
Part 5, How Dictatorships Break Down, Succession and Collapse.
Despite putting up this massive front of invincibility, these regimes possess inherent, deeply structural weaknesses. And the crucial point is this: succession is basically the Achilles heel of a personalist dictatorship. Remember, to survive, the dictator intentionally destroyed any independent institutions and violently eliminated anyone competent enough to be a rival. They dismantled succession rules entirely to protect themselves today. But this means that when the dictator eventually dies, either naturally or by force, there's absolutely no system in place to transfer power. Their death almost always triggers an immediate chaotic systemic collapse. Finally, Part 6, the aftermath of intervention. Why post-dictator states fail. Let's apply this math to real-world foreign policy and look at the pretty grim reality of what happens when the international community steps in. The researchers deliver a very stark, data-backed warning here. Violently ousting personalist leaders, think of figures like Gaddafi in Libya or Saddam Hussein in Iraq, has only a very modest chance of actually resulting in democracy. While it is super tempting to think that removing a tyrant automatically paves the way for freedom, the data shows it much more frequently leads to new autocracies, vicious civil wars, or just complete state collapse. And based on everything we've covered today, you probably understand exactly why these states fail post-intervention. It's basically the dictator's playbook coming back to haunt the country. The political and civil institutions were intentionally destroyed years ago. The rival talent that could have potentially led a new democracy was murdered or fled into exile long ago. The regular military is hollow and politicized, completely unable to keep basic order. And the environment of terror has created these intense, paranoid, survivalist in-group loyalties. The dictator systematically eradicated the very building blocks required for a free society to function. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. We've seen the cold math. We know the playbook. If violently toppling a personalist dictator is mathematically highly likely to result in just another autocracy or a completely failed state, how should the international community actually help? How do we break the cycle without making the situation even worse for the people living there? It's a heavy question for sure, and it completely challenges the conventional wisdom of foreign intervention. Thank you so much for joining me today on this explainer. I really hope this gave you a whole new lens for viewing global events. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.